about the videos that were shown, the Tricia Brown one? Because I think this thing of gesture and is quite a common place to start. Maybe the thinking, whether all movement is thinking or not. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at Trio A and I was wondering, you know, you can look at Trio A and see it as an expression of subjective agency. Like you could look at Yvonne Rainer and go, she's doing this, she's doing that. Or you could take up another perspective, which I've been articulating today, and looking at the kind of decentering of the self in the production of movement. So, I mean, I think I'd be interested to hear from you, Shaun, how you saw that, you know, what it suggested to you.
Yes, well, I think that one, as you say, it involves some work to put yourself into the kind of movement that, in a certain sense, pushes you away from a centered conception of the self. So there's a kind of tension, at least from what I saw in what you were saying, and if this in fact is a good expression of what we saw in some of the dances, a tension between something like a self and then something like a non-self, much as you might find maybe in meditation practice. Sure. But it's not clear to me that this kind of follows along Nietzsche or Deleuze's thought that in some sense that what they're questioning is the kind of traditional conception of what a self is, of course. I'm not sure if one starts with that traditional conception, says, oh, now we engage in some kind of practice to kind of pull ourselves away from that self, deconstruct it, or to emerge into some new non-self or decentered type of existence. So I'm not sure if that makes sense to you.
Oh, it's a bit tricky. I don't find it that easy to hear what you're saying, but I think you're queering the movement away from the self.
Yes.
Yeah. So for me, that's why I call it a speculative reading, but I think I wouldn't say that like all dance practices, I'm not saying all dance practices or all actions or all dancing involves that, but I do think that in certain kinds of postmodern dancing it requires that kind of a movement. And to that end I draw on, I suppose I should look at you too, sorry. To that end, I'm drawing on these concepts articulated by Deleuze in Nietzschean philosophy to think through that. So it's a particular field of practice, but then I did a workshop in Buddhist meditation combined with Feldenkrais technique, and we did a really great exercise, and it was starting to begin with awareness in the hara or in the stomach, and then kind of shifting awareness into, while maintaining that, shifting awareness into different parts of the body. And that I had to do something. I had to let go of a certain kind of centre, and then there was the kind of I suppose a kind of serial experience of different kinds of centre, and for me that also involved a kind of decentering of the self. And I think, I mean, I'd be interested in practitioners of improvisation, how you feel, or practitioners of contact improvisation. So I suppose what I'm saying is I think there are a range of practices where you could bring these concepts to bear, but they're very much a kind of subset of this greater conceptual picture.
Right. Yeah, so I think I can understand that. I think an interesting question is something like, how should we try to aim for such decentering of self? Should this become some kind of practice for us? And if so, then I think that part of the interesting philosophical issue is something that goes towards this question of what exactly does it mean to be human, as opposed to, say, a non-human animal. Because I would think that non-human animals also enjoy a kind of movement similar to this when, say, they are, it depends on how you conceive of what a self is, of course, but if you think of something like being totally involved in the performance, whether it's dance or whether it's a hunt or whether it's an athletic performance or whatever, somehow or other you can lose yourself. You lose yourself in the play. Gadamer talks about this, for example. And then the question is, if you do lose yourself that way, you become something less than human or more than human, or at least something different from what we traditionally call human. At least that kind of question is an interesting philosophical question that could come out of some of these types of performances and practices.
I think this, ooh, hello, okay. I think that there's been a lot of really interesting work on the animal recently and on just that whole philosophical Western tradition of saying, the human is a rational animal and the human is something different from the animal, and I think that is really important work. And I suppose I would put it next door to this Nietzschean, Deleuzian thrust, which is really saying beneath the carapace of the human, there lie these other elements and forces. So Nietzsche and Deleuze, none of them deny the phenomenon of subjectivity. And then we with respect to the phenomenon of subjectivity, we can spend a lot of time thinking and talking about what does it mean to be human, or what does it mean to be human, and is that different from being animal, or do we want to really kind of rethink the human in relation to the animal? But for Deleuze and Nietzsche, they have a project in a way, and it's a skeptical project. It's one that Nietzsche has, Nietzsche calls it philosophy with a hammer, and it does kind of smash into some other concepts that we have, and it's counterintuitive, it goes against common sense. So I think it does, on the one hand, we can think the human in terms of experience, in terms of action, in terms of the body, in terms of feeling, conscious thought, finding intentionality in action, like that's all an absolutely fine way to be thinking. We can think that as a kind of level, as really a mode of interpretation of something that lies beneath. And I think we can also maybe through that, I think it will be interesting to question what is the animal, and what is the animal in us, what is the animal in animal? Do we want to draw a distinction? I mean, I think, the kind of ontogenetic notion of force also calls in question the distinction between the human, the animal, and the environment, because its notion of bodily formation is relational. So the environment becomes part of bodily formation, as does our relations with animals. So the issue of corporeal porosity or corporeal boundary is an emergent and changing thing, and I think perhaps if we go through thinking that, it might provoke a different kind of ecological thinking within which the human occurs as a phenomenon.
I tend to agree with that idea. One question I had for you, if you care to think about the notion of habit. You talked a little bit about habit in the paper, and in one respect, I would like to think about habit as itself a kind of intelligent thing, an intelligent kind of practice. John Dewey, for example, distinguishes between a habit that is intelligent and something like a habit that is just simply repetition. Others, Gilbert Ryle, for example, thinks that a habit is simply repetitive and non-intelligent, pure behavior, let's say. And so if we think of habit as intelligent, would you say that there's a lot of habit involved in those dances, or is it pure spontaneity, in some sense, that doesn't rely on habitual practices?
Can I firstly say that I love and have used your work in The Body Shapes the Mind, and your distinction between body image and body schema in thinking through the development of what I call movement subjectivity. And I think that body schema, like as a mode of organisation that forms in relation between a body and its environment, is incredibly useful. And I think another way of thinking that is the adoption of habit in the body. I find, I was mentioning that to somebody, Ravesson's work on habit fantastic and useful as an account of the way in which a body will adopt. Somebody was saying a form of patterning. Maybe that was you, Simon. So I think habit is a mode of intelligence. I think that the habitual works, the way I kind of talk about it in relation to your work in the field of phenomenology, is to see corporeal schemata as produced through kinesthetic practices and traditions, and they emerge in the body of the dancer as a set of dispositions and tendencies and skills and facilities. Now, your question was something about, I think, the iteration of difference in the reproduction of habit. Was your question that a question that, do I see dancing as the enunciation of habit? Was that the question?
Well, obviously, in those dances, the dancer has a lot of skill in what she's doing. I'm wondering if that skill, how you would interpret that skill in perhaps in terms of habits, and how you would interpret habit, whether or not habit is intelligent, or as someone like Dewey would say, or habit is just sort of just letting things happen automatically, without thought, perhaps.
I see what it is. The question is that intelligence? Do I want to say that that formation of habit and its enunciation can be thought of as a mode of intelligence? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought you would say. That was the.
I mean, I love habit. I think it's incredibly important. I think that habits facilitate. Habits are formed within the context of particular kinds of practices. So different kinesthetic traditions select and create their different modes of habit, and they speak to the ways in which we attend to the body, the kinds of things attended to, as well as the kinds of actions kind of pre-selected. But I also think that some practices, some dance practices and some somatic practices, such as Alexander technique, take a critical view of habit and see it as limiting, and almost as limiting upon what a body can do. And so in that sense, I think they aim to kind of confront habit so as to, what I would say, enable the production of corporeal difference or greater corporeal possibility. So habit is fabulous, can be limiting, very much framed within particular kinds of contexts of practices, but yes, definitely intelligent. So the issue of the non-conscious aspect of it doesn't take away from its intelligibility. What do you think?
I totally agree. I mentioned John Dewey because of his notion of habit. He also wrote introductions to some of Alexander's books. I was a great fan of Alexander technique. But you're right. I mean, the Alexander technique really calls attention to kind of the unintelligent habits, the habits that we get into and that we're not even aware of in any kind of way, and that we need to change in order to make ourselves bring a better posture and a better way of moving, which again would then be a better way of thinking. As it's been explained to me, Alexander technique has a lot to do with being in the world in the right way, not just with posture or movement, but something more meaningful in terms of a way of life. So I tend to agree with you.
Can I just ask Shaun one, do we have time? Yeah, I just thought it might be useful perhaps to talk about marking, because I found that incredibly interesting, what you said about marking dance, and I'd also be interested in what people in this room think about marking.
I think we would like to be included.
Sorry?
I'm going to speak for everyone. I would like to feel more included in this.
All right, well, shall we just move then? It was just the structure of today was talk, talk, talk between, open up.
Yeah, that's what we'll get to.
So, but you want to do it now?
The last question. So, Shaun, just if you would respond to Philipa's last query.
So, sorry, what was that? What was that question?
It wasn't a question, I was just raising it as a topic for discussion, really. Just this notion of marking.
Oh, the marking, yeah. And I thought you were addressing the audience when you were actually asking it.
Just the idea, you know, that marking is well, you know, improves performance, it's a form of abbreviation, and that somebody, you cited somebody, that marking is movement in the abstract, and there are a lot of different ideas there, and actually I am interested in what people in the room think about that idea, because I think people will have different views about what's involved when you mark something.
And it does speak
Yeah,
to
I'd like
this,
to hear.
pre-noetic and the habits and the way in which unconscious thought and awareness come together. So maybe I will open it up now.
It's probably not a question, it's more a statement. When you are working at what would seem to be an unconscious level in the arts, as you've talked about and everyone here has probably experienced, you're not letting go of self, you're letting go of control, and that's very different. So the unconscious is still self, a part of self. It's just not that controlled self.
Ria, you had a question, and then to Simon.
Yeah, so that was really interesting to have you two side by side like that. And I'm just thinking of the kind of, if you might like to think of a neurobiological reading of habit, might be an interesting kind of way to think about those kinesthetic practices that are critical of it. Because I do think it's not about so much about the thinking that's happening then as about the not thinking. So if the neural pathway gets kind of so hot that it's the only choice someone can make. And so I think it opens up a space again to, I just bring time up all the time, don't I? To open up that idea of what if we could expand time so that before someone acts, they can make a choice about what kind of pathway that would, they would pay attention to. So this kind of brings up something that you said, Philipa, about awareness, and I think, we need to put awarenesses. And I'm wondering, so my question is about, could decentering actually be more defamiliarising? Because centering suggests a hierarchy, there's a kind of like a centre that someone can kind of hold and fix, rather than it becoming maybe a habit, the centre being a habit. So what if decentering was a defamiliarising? And in that case, why are these postmodern dancers, particularly the kind of elders, so driven to feel that out of balanceness, or the kind of, to kind of... And how might they actually be having like creating conditions in which they might experience time differently. So that's kind of just pulling together a couple of key insights from your talks together there, and I'd like you to talk to time a bit. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Philipa, do you want to go first?
Well, two things. It's defamiliarisation and time, and I think, yeah, you could work with the figure of defamiliarisation, definitely, and see what that might do. You asked why are the postmodern dancers driven towards defamiliarisation? Yeah, I think it's in part about what is it to generate movement material? What are you looking for in making movement? Who is the one who makes movement? How is movement made? How might movement emerge? What are the limitations to making movement? How can movement be made differently? I think they might be some of the concerns. I think also, like, Matt, you were talking like last night about postmodern dance being a development on modern dance, and it's a, you know, sometimes like speaking to an earlier set of concerns. But I think you can see, say, in Cunningham and in Graham, modern dance, there's very much a set of vocabularies. You really see that the set of vocabularies. So, and I saw Saburo Teshigawa in Tokyo, so it's not just that kind of modern dance. And I'd seen him before, and I really saw the same kind of set of vocabularies in his work. So that's an issue for everyone. And Alice, you know, with improvisation, you know, wanting to open up to something and not to sort of fall back on what you're already doing, how to do that. And I suppose it's that, so one is the value of producing difference, and then the other is the strategic means whereby you might do that. I think they're both sort of things to
Shaun,
think
did you have a comment on time? No.
I just wanted to. So the distinction might be that one might be doing this because they're creating art, and the other distinction, which we're kind of talking about, is just the human more generally, and what they might be doing. Yeah, so that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, Shaun.
Yeah. So I have not engaged myself in postmodern dance. So maybe someone who has would be able to answer the question about to what extent it is a kind of improvisation. But also, to what extent is there anticipation involved as you are making your movements, or as the movements come to you? To what extent do you get surprised by the kind of movements that you find yourself making? Or to what extent do you actually anticipate your next move? To the extent that you are anticipating your next move, it seems to me that you could still talk about a sense or a temporal structure to your action that is found in many different kinds of actions. So that I don't know that time or the experience of time would necessarily get disrupted. But to the extent that you might be surprised by the movements that come to you, perhaps there is a kind of disruption of temporal by the kind of surprise that might get generated in that movement. But since I don't dance, I don't do that kind of dance, I'm not sure what the answer is.
Simon
we
has
hear
a
from
question.
Alice and Olivia, who were both improvisational dancers and
So,
yeah, it'd just be good to hear from some of the dancers.
yes, great.
Okay.
Bringing around the
Just like on this point though, because like we're talking about surprise.
So let Simon ask a question and then we'll have the
Okay.
answers speak, okay? I'll try and moderate.
Sorry, I'm doing your job now.
Hello. Shaun, I'm not sure if you can see us, but this is Simon. Hello, how are you? So, you know, as I was listening to you both speaking, there's this feeling that comes up quite often for me, came up again, and that is that I rankle at the glorification of consciousness. And I'm very taken by Susan Hurley's notion of pre-reflective awareness as a kind of ground that underlies consciousness. And so when I heard you, Shaun, say that you lose yourself, I wondered maybe we're always lost in that sense, but maybe that kind of being lost is actually a kind of being found, and that being conscious is a kind of being lost.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to?
Let me start. Do you want me to respond to that?
Yes, please, yes.
Oh, yeah. With respect to the unconscious that has been mentioned a couple of times, it seems to me that in any action there are non-conscious aspects. When I reach for a glass to pick up something, I'm not conscious precisely what my muscles, in any kind of precise terms, what my muscles are doing, and so I might have just a pre-reflective awareness of the fact that I'm reaching for something, but there's a lot that's going on there that I'm not conscious of in terms of what the body is doing. The body, in a certain way, takes care of itself in accomplishing such actions. So I think there's a lot of things that we could call unconscious or non-conscious involved in action, and that we do that naturally every day when we engage in action. And it's not something that we have to strive towards in order to get rid of consciousness or anything like that. There's a lot of unconsciousness there at work. There is also pre-reflective awareness. I totally agree with that. Hurley talks about it. The phenomenologists talk about it. Gibson talks about it. There's a lot of pre-reflective awareness involved as well. And rarely, I would say, rarely do we ever reflect upon the actual pragmatics of our action, bodily aspects of action. We don't need to, because the more we would have to reflect on that, the less energy we would have to do what we need to do. So reflection is something added on, and if you think that consciousness is just reflective consciousness, I think that's not quite right. I think what we're calling pre-reflective awareness is, in fact, itself a kind of consciousness. Less of a reflective type of consciousness, but still, nonetheless, an awareness of some sort. I would equate with consciousness.
Hello. Paya, my name is Paya. I'm a dancer. So I also, so many things, but on marking, I thought that was really interesting, the way you spoke about it, and that this was something you were interested in. And I think an important distinction to make is that it's different in ballet to let's say, a postmodern field of practice, this idea of marking. So in ballet, I think the gestures represent movements that we all know, and so that it's kind of like a form of sign language that everybody understands. And if you've done ballet enough, you know that means a pirouette, and then you do a Batman, and then you do 5, and you go 2 to 1, and 1 to 2, and back, and everyone goes yes. That happens. Yes, sure. And then in postmodern dance, or in a field more that you're talking about, Philipa, I think that marking, I love to watch dancers mark. I think it's a beautiful thing. I always think I always want to make a work where they just mark, apparently the whole thing, because what I think they're doing is working with their attention via another bodily passage. And I think that I think that's what they're doing. They're actually honing their attention through something that's seemingly less than the apparent end point. And I never find it less than, I find it entirely captivating. And there's a very famous, Rose's Anna Teresa de Keersmacher has done it a few times. At the beginning of a work, the dancers are on the stage and they're kind of marking it out. And it's always my favourite bit. I mean, it's amazing when they get to the dancing, but there's something very enlivening about that space where you feel like you're watching how they're thinking, quite literally, and in a quieter kind of space where you get to sort of encounter that. And as a dancer, I think that's very interesting, and I think what they're doing is actually being highly attentive and are kind of more, reining in their capacity to pay a very fine attention in a complex field of becomings. So I thought it was interesting that you mentioned it, but I do think it has a very different iteration according to different genre.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name's Matthew, and I need to move while I figure out what I want to say. So, I totally agree with this idea about marking, and marking potentially as a pedagogical strategy to reduce cognitive load in certain moments. It seems to serve that purpose. That's how I primarily use it. There's also this question about time and about choice. And when I'm in these moments, right, that the past, the present, and the future seem to all be internally related, maybe in Maxine Cheech Johnstone's language, right, that they don't exist separate from each other. And I have the past with me as a sedimentation of intelligences, both personal and cultural, that become movement habit, and that I am fully in the present, and that I am attending to what the environment, social and physical, affords me. And I also exist in the future, or in the imaginal space of what could happen. What are the possibilities that could happen that seem more tangible or specific in the short term and then become more diffuse as they seem to exist further out in time. So yes, some things, and then I love this idea of the master's riposte, of the switch in those energies. So when do I see possibility in front of me and enact it in the world, or when do I perceive possibility, have my habit with me, know possibilities, but also fold back in, and I'm willing to be surprised by where the dance takes me. So there's this sort of continual flow of past, present, and future rolled together that allow for choice, but also allow for surprise. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you. Could I ask the dancers, in the practice of marking, and I acknowledge it can be different in different kinds of dance forms, but in the practice of marking, can you discover anything, or are you just repeating what you already know, or can you discover anything in the process of marking?
There's an answer to that.
Hello, my name's Shaun. And this discussion of marking is really very interesting, I think, for us dancers, because I think marking in a way is a chance to step back from the complete engagement with the activity and to integrate what's going on in the dance in a different way. It also provides a kind of a space for imagination to engage with what's happening. And Matt sort of talked about that a bit as well, that it is actually a completely new space for the dance to exist in a way. That doesn't require that kind of 100% commitment to the physicality, but which does provide a kind of a thoughtful and imaginative kind of engagement with what's happening. So.
Yeah.
There's a fascinating discussion going on here that I absolutely love. And while both of you were delivering your papers or your presentations, I kept thinking of something Simon Penny said yesterday about language and the terms that we use, and language and the terms that we use and how we understand those terms. And especially in the second presentation, I got quite confused with some of the, I would say, not only how the terms were being used, but the frames in which those terms emerged, i.e. Nietzsche, Deleuze, and how it pertained to that ontological framing, and how I understood those terms in different framings. For example, the term force. And I immediately went to some of my background in physics, and I kept thinking, okay, what force? And then you talked about two forces, and then I was just like, okay, two forces, and I got confused with a kind of transdisciplinary notion of three forces. And then somewhere in between there, I realized I was trying to negotiate 4 different disciplinary frameworks. And I got so confused. And I wanted to really thank the dancers, and I say the dancers because I have an entire career as a professional dancer, of grounding me back into precisely what the topic was about, dancing and thinking. And I just wanted to say one thing, that there was always something in me that when I danced, it seemed to be as if I was making space, not only for thinking from my mind brain, but my body was accumulating information, sensory information in the space that connected a kind of a mental imaging to an emotional mapping through the movement itself. And recently I had a conversation with a physicist, actually. He's the head of the Triumph Particle Accelerator at UBC, the University of British Columbia. And we were talking about the notion of the Higgs field and the Higgs particle as an excitation of space. And then I told him, actually, I feel as if, as I move through space, my body is accumulating mass as information. And then I have to figure out what is the nature of that information that my body is accumulating through space. So then I get back to the idea of force again, and then I'm trying to negotiate, well, which kind of force am I thinking about in which kind of knowledge field? So I guess what I'm saying is, thank you for confusing me, but also thank you to the dancers for unconfusing me and making me realize actually what my dance actually does for me.
Oh, okay. One last one.
Hi, I'm Jo, and I'm an improviser by trade and practice and life. And I think one thing potentially would be great if there was more time to discuss was that improvisation is in and of itself the practice, and that marking is not differentiated as something different. So it's not, we're not looking at a future dance practice that we're kind of remembering or imagining for a future tense, but that the process of marking or expanding embodiment, bodily imagination, occurs simultaneously, past, present, future, in that moment. So that was just a thought to add.
That's fantastic. Just as a last sort of comment before we finish, in terms of there's a lovely moment in your book, Shaun, where you talk about reaching for the cup, and that's before you decide to reach for the cup, you're already reaching for the cup, and that's the pre-noetic notion. And I always thought that in the self-organization of cognition, that in fact, how long does this pre-noetic extend? So if I'm going to paint in my studio that evening, am I already painting when I get up in the morning and I'm having my coffee? Am I already doing things that I'll be doing next year? Has everything been organizing my readiness towards the moment of decision at the age of 40? I think that in the self-organization of cognition, that these timescales actually are much bigger and much more extended, in the readiness of the body gathers itself together in all kinds of ways that become anxiety or a thought or an imagination or a direction or any number of things. And I was curious that the kind of the pre-noetic is sort of just tied to, I'm already grabbing for the coffee before I know I'm grabbing for the coffee.
Yeah, so I think this is tied into the notion of habit, because a habit which might take a long time to form and which we might hold on to for a good number of years and so forth, A habit is, in a certain sense, acting in a pre-noetic fashion with respect to a particular action. So a lot of habit remains non-conscious for us as we engage in action, and then that kind of non-conscious aspect of it is part of the pre-noetic dimension of an action. And it's not just that a moment before the action we have pre-noetic and then we have the action, but rather the pre-noetic extends through the action. So it's always kind of ongoing. Our habits shape in some way the kind of activities we engage in, and that's a kind of ongoing process. Yeah. So I think thank you for those remarks.
Okay, well, let's all thank Shaun Gallagher and Philipa Rothfield.